Thank you so much to Georgetown University, Qatar, to Dr. Abdallah Al-Aryan and everyone else on the team for hosting this important conference. It's the topic that you wish would just disappear and not be relevant, but your lived experiences and your research remind you on a regular basis that it unfortunately continues to be relevant. So I don't have a lot of time to go into something that's much more complicated than we have time for, but I will try to just give a broad overview about the racialization of Muslims, particularly in the United States, which is the area or the geography that I focus on. And I'll start with kind of a known truth, which is that race is a social construct, right? It is not a real biological fact. It is something that a society constructs, usually to the benefit of a particular group of people that are racialized at the top of a hierarchy and to the detriment of those that are racialized at the bottom of a hierarchy. And so as a result, I approach race and racism as a hierarchical construct, social construct. And what I focus a lot on in my research is the role of religious identity in the racialization process. Traditionally, if you look at the literature, especially in the United States, race tends to be socially constructed largely based on physical features and then to some extent geographic origins, which overlap onto physical features. So when you think of skin color, hair texture, facial features, but in fact, religious identity it serves as a racial marker, meaning that someone may be white presenting within that social context, but having a particular religious identity, in this case we're focusing on Muslims, it effectively, for lack of a better description, blackens them, right? Because in the US, and I think this is globally, the more black you are, the lower you are on the hierarchy, and the more white you are in terms of how your race is socially constructed, then the more superior you are presumed to be. So being Muslim, and it's definitely before 9/11, but I'm going to focus largely on the post 9/11 era because other panelists have talked a lot about the history, has served as a derogatory, pejorative, adverse racial marker. And in my book, The Racial Muslim, what I do is examine the different ways in which racialization affects Muslims, particularly looking at the combination of religiosity and political ideology. And so many of us are familiar with kind of the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, or the good black, the bad black, the good woman, the bad woman. So this concept of what is good and what is bad as defined by those in power in a particular context to serve their interests is well known. But I think that at least with the racialization of Muslims in the United States and perhaps in other Western countries in particular, it's more of an internal hierarchy where the more religious and politically dissident you are, the more likely you are to be targeted by the state and by organized Islamophobic groups in terms of securitization, stigmatization, deportation, and all of the negative consequences, which I'll go into in a minute. So I call that the religious dissident racial Muslim. And that's why when you have Muslims, say in the United States, that say, well, I don't understand, I haven't experienced Islamophobia, and oftentimes those people are co-opted into being the spokespersons of defending the colorblind and non-racist narrative of America. Well, oftentimes because it's not a coincidence, they are what I call the secular apolitical or secular mainstream political Muslim, which is kind of the most ideal Muslim minority. So you have the religious dissident, and then you have the religious that is mainstream or apolitical, that tends to be seen as a cultural threat, in addition to a security threat, but particularly a cultural threat, which is the woman who wears the headscarf, the man who says, I need accommodation on Friday to go to prayer, or I need accommodation 5 times a day to pray. And then you have the secular dissident, and then the secular. And I use these terms secular and religious more for ascriptive, based on ascriptive definitions, what people perceive that particular Muslim to be. And then to determine kind of where Muslims fall into this topology, which then defines how they're treated by the state and by their neighbors and by their coworkers and by their teachers and their classmates and members of the public. I look at 4 factors, some of which have been addressed by scholars in the room in their own work, which is white Christian supremacy, and that affects all minorities. So if you are not white and Christian, and white is also a social construction, which I go into detail in my book, that about 100 years ago, if you were Italian Catholic or if you were Irish Catholic, you weren't fully white. You were not quite white. You were somewhere in between. And so there was a racial hierarchy even within the European immigrant identity groups. But interestingly, whiteness has expanded as a social construct in the United States to now include those groups, which now, ironically, the 2nd or 3rd generation can have been open about their own Islamophobic views, seeming to forget the history of oppression against them. So white Christian supremacy, xenophobia, which is a staple of American culture, notwithstanding that it is a nation of immigrant settler colonialists, Orientalism, and then American empire in Muslim-majority countries. So the combination of those 4 kind of broad macro factors contributes to the racialization of Muslims, particularly what I call, in short form, immigrant Muslims. And what I mean by that are Muslims who immigrated to the US after 1965, which is when the national origin quotas were lifted, because those of you who aren't familiar with immigration law in the US, between 1924 and 1965, the immigration laws intentionally Northwest Europeanized the American population, because it set very strict quotas restricting who could come to the US and immigrate, with the intent of keeping Eastern European Jews, Italian Catholics, and Irish Catholics out. And then you have a long history of anti-Asian and anti-Chinese exclusion laws. So immigration law in the US is highly tied to racialization and racism. And that's why it was no coincidence that Stephen Miller, who was one of Trump's senior aides, his primary objective was to change immigration laws. He wanted to go back to the pre-1965 era. He did not succeed, except to instruct the Department of Homeland Security to exercise its authority to minimize or deny visas, deny naturalization applications, delay naturalization applications, and in some cases denaturalize people from Muslim-majority countries. So the consequences of racialization are wide and quite negative. The first and foremost is that you're treated as a group, not as an individual. Right? And oftentimes your group is perceived and defined by what we'll call the lowest common denominator. In other words, if there is one person who behaves in a way that is illegal or violent, then that person becomes the representative of the race. Right? In contrast, if you're a member of the privileged racial group, you are treated as an individual, which is why, as Deepa Kumar, my lovely colleague from Rutgers, stated, is that if you have a white male who commits a terrorist act, you don't have the government going into every white community or every Christian community or every veteran community. Timothy McVeigh was a veteran, right, of 1995 bombings. You essentially say, okay, this is one individual who acted illegally, who is, quote unquote, a bad person or a violent person, but this doesn't necessarily reflect on everybody who shares their identity. When you're racialized, you don't get that privilege. So you're constantly having to perform your identity in a way to prove your innocence, to prove your sense of belonging, to prove that you're loyal, to prove that you're law-abiding and law-adhering, which is quite exhausting. And that is a burden that you have to carry throughout your daily life. And we see that burden affecting the psychology and the mental health of our young Muslims, particularly in university settings and school settings. The other consequence is the securitization of your identity. And so in the US, and I don't think it's just the United States, the forum or the context in which racialization of Muslims is most robust is in the national security context. And that's why, those of us who have been studying this, it's not a coincidence that the way in which Muslims have suffered from Islamophobia is often at airports, in immigration applications vis-a-vis the FBI and criminal prosecutions. For those who are interested in how the FBI and the prosecutors have used national security laws and counterterrorism laws against Muslims, I'm going to put a pitch for an article that I wrote called Manufacturing Terrorism, Race Entrapment and Manufacturing Homegrown Terrorism, which looks at there's more than 600 cases over 20 years of the government taking all of the billions of dollars that it was granted, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, focused on Muslims in America to prosecute them. And what you'll find is almost half of them are sting operations, and the large majority of those sting operations are manufactured crimes. This is how desperate they are to create the boogeyman, that they have to manufacture the terrorist plots. And unfortunately, no questions are asked by the public, and so they just see the press release and see Muhammad, Ahmad, Hussein, Osama, Omar, and they think, okay, this just validates everything that we think about, negative things that we think about Muslims. So Muslims are everything bad and nothing good, such as we're a civilizational threat, terrorists, illegal immigrants, inassimilable wards of the state, a cultural threat, unwelcome refugees, misogynists, religious zealots and extremists, despots, authoritarians, and anti-democratic. We're a fifth column. We're a national security threat. We support Islamofascism, creeping Sharia. We're Muslim invaders. We're wolves in sheep's clothing. We're illiberal. We're the Muslim peril, and we're the Muslim Trojan horse. These are all narratives, some very explicit, that those of us living in the United States have had to deal with for over 20 years in one form or one shape or the other. And ironically or paradoxically, it comes from both the liberal and the conservatives, right? It's just a matter of how it's manifested. On the one hand, you have liberals who are eager to patronize and eager to save and eager to essentially be the benefactors, but they will not allow us to be equals, right? They will not allow us to be people in power or people with influence within society. So as long as it is kind of a patronizing relationship, I have found that the liberals are, quote unquote, less Islamophobic, whereas the conservatives are much more, kind of what we may be familiar with, where they're much more overt and they use this terminology. And so there is this tension between desire and disavowal, right? There's Islamophilia, which is, again, oftentimes within liberal circles, this desire to consume the exotica and sensationalism of Muslim experiences and creating these little, taking a Muslim woman and making her seem like she's so innocent and harmless, but as long as she is in a position of infantilization, or as if we're helping her and saving her, the Afghan women that we must save, as opposed to the Afghan women who are equals, who are parliamentarians, who are lawyers, who do not need to be saved, and in fact probably can do a lot to save American women from American misogyny. That is the only time that you will see the liberals willing to accept the Muslim woman. The other component of the racialization or manifestation or consequence is the Islamophobia industrial complex. And I think this is really important for those who study Islamophobia in the West. There is a $1 billion industry and it's really remarkable how afraid they are of us. That you have at least 39 Islamophobic organizations, and then there's tens of, sometimes up into the hundreds of funders that essentially create this network. And this is not a conspiracy theory because there's been much research that's been done on it. Fear Inc., John Esposito's work, this has all now been documented. But you have a constellation of different groups who all have one thing in common, which is to criminalize, stigmatize, exclude physically from the soil, and oppress Muslims, particularly in the West. Evangelical Christians, not all of them, but a certain segment of evangelical Christians, a certain segment of Zionists, Jews and Zionist Christians, conservative anti-multiculturalists, atheists, white nationalists, and some leftist liberals, right? So there is this kind of convergence of interest where they will use their culture, the culture war fault lines within their particular country, and we become the pawns in which they fight those culture wars. And so as a result, I think what's most remarkable or what's most troubling is that there's no stigma. And this, I think, is what makes me convinced that Islamophobia is still alive and well, is if you can still get votes based on being Islamophobic, if you don't lose your job or you don't lose your promotion or you don't at least have some social stigma associated with being Islamophobic, then that means the society accepts it. And instead, it's interpreted as rational debate, not racism. It's lucrative. You can raise money around it for your nonprofit. And effectively feeds into white American nationalism, then we still have a problem. And that's essentially what I see in the United States. So I'll just end with kind of three themes that hopefully can generate some discussion. Is I think that Islamophobia has gone through three phases, and now we're in the fourth phase, and this is what's an interesting question for us today. The first was 2001 to 2008 under Bush. That was the very sharp-edged war on terror, no holds barred, militarization, prosecutions. It was the entrenchment and mainstreaming of Islamophobia, especially in the national security context. And then you had the Obama era, where the policies didn't change, but the rhetoric got softer. So you started with the Cairo speech, which was supposed to be this olive branch, but in fact, Obama turned out to be just as at least anti-Muslim in his national security policies as Bush. And in fact, for 8 years, never visited a mosque, not once. It was only in the last months of his second term that he went to a Baltimore mosque, which is attended predominantly by African-American Muslims. And the reason why that's important is because he didn't even want to have a picture with Arab-looking Muslims or Pakistani-looking Muslims, because he spent 8 years trying to convince the United States public that he wasn't Muslim, because the anti-black racism that was stigmatized, it's there, but at least you do lose your job if you're openly anti-black in the US, the only sign of progress we can say, which is pretty low-hanging fruit. But you could be anti-Muslim. And so that's how they attacked him. And then finally you have the Trump era, which was a blessing in disguise. I know that sounds very contradictory, but he was so openly Islamophobic. He ran on it, he got votes on it, and this is what generated what we're doing today, is that we spent 8 years trying to convince the American public that anti-Muslim racism was real. And they kept arguing, no, it's just national security policy. And after Trump came, it was obvious, and people had to kind of pick a side, right? And the Muslim ban was very explicit. And the reason why I think it's a silver lining is because it mobilized the Muslim American community. And we started to see this new generation of post-9/11 coming of age Muslims, especially in college and now they're professionals, demanding equality and no longer spending all their time, as they did under Bush and Obama, trying to prove that they were good Muslims, trying to prove that they were loyal, trying to prove that they belonged. But now you have kind of this more left, radical, in a positive way, equality demanding group of younger Muslims. And so the question for us today is, where are we now, right? We've gone through these three phases, and I think there's at least three different categories. There's patronization, there's open hostility, and there's invisibility. And so I'll just leave you with those three to kind of think about. Maybe there are other categories, but we need to, racism is very nimble, and it is because it's systemic, and so just because it doesn't look the same doesn't mean that it has disappeared. Thank you.
Over to you, Professor Ma.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank Professor Abdullah and Professor Karina for inviting me to be here. And also I want to thank previous two panels really talk about Islamophobia and the nation state, Islamophobia and empire. And actually, when I look at all these panels, I say, wow, I'm going to talk about China. So how can we define China? Is China a nation state? Is China a empire? So first, I would like to define all these different polities. Of course, when we talk about Islamophobia in European context, a Mediterranean context, we really started from a Renaissance, industrial revolutions, modernities. So that's a context. And also, of course, when we talk about empires, we really talk about European empire, Euro-American empires. It's a colonial empire. But I think it's really difficult to talk about like India and China, because I think even today it's really hard to call China and India as kind of empire. And also it's really hard to call China and India as a nation state. So basically I would say, well, for China, at least there were nation state process in early 20th century. Before that, of course, China was an empire. And today I think China probably is, or should be called as kind of a civilization state. This is really a new term, I think. I realized when I was researching on this term, I think like 3 or 4 years ago, someone from Financial Times, they really discussed the civilization state, especially China and India. So I will talk about Islamophobia briefly in China as nation state, in China as empire, in China as civilization state. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about ethnicization, not really racialization, because I think race and racial is more like a Euro-American context term. So I'm going to use racial and ethnic interchangeably, basically, to talk about how Islam and Muslim in China were ethnicized or racialized. So first I want to talk about China as empire. When Islamophobia began to rise, I think around like 17th century. When you look at 17th century, I think it's probably more like a European 17th century, 18th century. Let's say what happened in China, why you have Islamophobia at that time. And actually, when you look at 17th century Islamophobia, that's the century when China as a dynasty began to transform as an empire. The rising Manchu Empire, the Manchus from Manchuria conquered Han Chinese of the Ming Dynasty. So that's why in that context, you can imagine Manchus as a Asian people, they tried to, or they actually conquered Central Eurasia, and actually they began to make ally with Mongols, with Uyghurs, Turks, and also Tibetans. That's really worried Han Chinese, because China used to be a dynasty, which means you really have one people, you really have one like imperial family, but now you really have kind of empire, you have different peoples. How can you identify the Chinese within a larger political entity? So that's why if you look at around, I think at the end of 17th century, Chinese Confucianism, or Chinese Confucians, they actually began to criticize Islam. For the really, absurd reasons, they basically attack Muslims for not observing Confucian cultures, for practicing Islamic calendar, and also for making some kind of, they call secret society. You can imagine in a Confucian society, Chinese basically, you cannot, for example, travel from county to county, province to province, unless you have some government certificate or approval. But the Muslims, you really have the tradition of traveling to different provinces to study Islam, to build kind of a network. So that's why Confucians began to attack Muslims. So in this context, you can imagine China began to transform from a dynasty to an empire. As I mentioned, the Manchus actually made ally with Muslims in Central Asia. So here we have a little bit difference between this empire and also Euro-American empire, because in this context, the Muslims were allies of Manchus. So that's why you see Confucian scholars attacked Muslims, political accusations, and also you see some kind of legal efforts. They try to discriminate a Muslim. But the Manchus, at this time, as I said, the Manchu built an empire. They really try to treat different peoples, Turks, Tibetans, Mongols, Chinese, equally. So that's why they did not really accept all this, Han or Confucian accusation. So that's why from an empire-wide perspective, I would say during this empire period, Muslims, of course, were accused by the Han Chinese or Confucians, but were not really punished or by the empire, by the state. So this is the first stage I want to talk about. And also at this time, in terms of racialization or ethnicization, Han Chinese always say Muslim in China as Turks or Uyghurs. So that's why they always attack the Muslim as being foreigner, as being Uyghur, as historical enemy, as historical frontier people. That's why you can imagine they have enough reason to attack Islam. And also, by the way, they call Islam as the religion of Uyghur. In Chinese, they actually call the religion of Hui. Hui used to be a transliteration for Uyghur. So that's why you have ethnicization of Islam as the religion of Hui people, Muslim as Hui people. That's a historical context. Now, in early 20th century, when Manchu dynasty, or the Manchu Empire transformed into a nation state, China began to build so-called Five People's Republic. And in this process, both Muslims, Manchus, Tibetans, Han Chinese, and of course the Mongols, they all became what we call equal citizens or equal people. So that's why during this time, we find it really interesting because the state discourse, nation-state discourse, they began to call Muslims, they began to define Muslims and Islam in terms of Arabs, not really with Turks from Central Asia, simply because at this time China began to build nation state, and also you see Arab countries also achieve independence. So that's why in a republic period, Chinese Muslims was basically studying at Al-Azhar, not really in Turkey or Istanbul. And also you can imagine the history of Islam began to be written from perspective of Sino-Arab interactions throughout history. So that's what they even talk about, even before Prophet Muhammad's time, how Arabs, treated in China. So that's what you can imagine in terms of racialization or ethnicization, Muslims began to be called as Arabs or associated with Arabs, especially for Chinese Muslim. If you look at all these textbooks or public discourses, they basically say, well, Muslim ancestors came from Middle East, especially Arabs. But today, in communist China, we have some new development, especially from 1949. You can imagine atheism began to attack Islam. That's why you really have a pure form of Islamophobia. But that situation actually changed after the 1970s. But today, we have a so-called new contemporary socialism. Muslims began to face a challenge. This is a real challenge, I would say, compared to nation state in the West, compared to Euro-American empires. Now I think, especially this stage, I would call China as civilization state, because communists began to define China, our Chinese communism, in terms of traditional Han culture, which means Christianity, Islam, even including Buddhism. That's not really pure Chinese culture. So that's the reason you have to Sinocize Mongols, you have to Sinocize Uyghurs, you have to Sinocize Tibetans, especially many of the so-called Arab-style mosques, especially minaret, was removed or reformed to build like a Confucian temple-style mosque. So that's why I think in the third stage nowadays, only India and China, probably to some extent, you can call Ottoman Turkey, New Ottoman, possible as this type of civilization state. But I would say mostly represented by China and India. They try to make one people, one culture, one civilization, one history. So that means Islam really faced a challenge. So nowadays, our Chinese government does not really talk about ethnicity, because when you talk about ethnicity, you really talk about foreigner, you really talk about foreign connections. So everything, people and religion have to be Sinicized. So that's the reason today I would say China and India probably represent a new type of Islamophobia. So I will stop here.
In Germany, and a few sentences on Germany just before I get started. This is not working? Oh, okay. Did I do something? I probably did something.
I think it's right on your lap.
It's there. That part is me now? Yes. Okay, great. Let me just put this back here. Okay, so once again, so I'm going to be talking about race and religion in the liberal Rechtsstaat, the rule of law, and the example here is Germany. And just a few sentences on Germany before I get started. So we're talking about Germany as a post-genocidal state and society. We're talking about Germany that is now home to around 5.5 million Muslims, and the total population of Germany is 82 million. Germany's home to the largest Palestinian community outside of the Middle East. It's now home to 1 million Syrians, and of course there are Turkish and also Bosnian refugees from the Bosnian War. So that's to give you just an idea of the Muslim population in Germany. Now, for this panel, I would like to zoom in on how German courts discuss race and religion. And of course, I'm using here race and religion because when you talk about it in that constellation, you know that Germany has, unfortunately, like kind of a very intimate historic experience with race and religion being anti-Semitism, obviously, as one of the, if you want to, prime kind of constellations of race and religion. So I'm specifically talking here about courts today and how they're referring to the concepts of objectivity and neutrality within the liberal rule of law state. And here, these are considered building blocks of the rule of law, Rechtsstaat, the liberal Rechtsstaat. And you'll see how they come back over and over again in the way the courts explain to the public what the Rechtsstaat is. And here, it sees itself as the bouche de la loi, the mouth of the law. So basically what they're doing is, in their own words, is using objectively binding neutral law in the judicial application, right? So while concepts such as objectivity and neutrality have been much criticized from the 19th century onwards, it is still widely held that the application of the law is objective and neutral, i.e. a technical application of abstract norms given in advance for concrete cases to be solved. So the application of law is first and foremost a matter of logically determining the will of the legislator in the event of a legal dispute. Now, against this backdrop, I would like to discuss 3 cases with you here, very recent cases that shed some light on the understanding of race and religion in German adjudication. First case is the Administrative Court of Baden-Württemberg in 2020 affirmed German authorities' decision to deny a Muslim man German citizenship over his refusal to shake hands with a female official. Now, what happened? In that said case, it concerned an application for German citizenship by a Lebanese man who had arrived in Germany as a student, completed his medical degree, and became a successful and well-reputed senior physician. He met all the criteria and got a perfect score on his nationality test. When he went to collect his certificate of naturalization, he politely refused the congratulatory handshake by the female official, a person whose hand he had shook on several prior occasions. He explained that after numerous arguments with his wife, a German Muslim, he had promised her to no longer greet other women with handshakes or hugs, as she objected to him having any physical contact with women outside of the context of his profession. Now, triggered by his refusal, the official reversed the approval of his naturalization request, a decision that was upheld by the Administrative Court in Stuttgart and the appeal before the Administrative Court in Baden-Württemberg. The court considered a handshake a German social norm and as such a legal requirement in order to qualify for German citizenship under the German Nationality Act. The court assessed that, quote, because of its societal and legal significance, the handshake forms part of German social norms. It is only since 2019 that the German Nationality Act requires that applicants fulfill German social norms, or so in German it's called Einordnung in die deutschen Lebensverhältnisse, fitting in German lifestyle. You have to fit into the German lifestyle. And this clause was brought in by a legislator officially wanting to exclude polygamous marriage, something that is in fact prohibited according to German civil and criminal law. Other preconditions for naturalization were a commitment to the rule of law, to have the right to permanent residency, and to have sufficient knowledge of German language, as well as knowledge of the German legal and societal system. Now, we see in this case how the term fitting into German lifestyle is now being used to constitute the handshake as German social norm without which citizenship can be refused, though the handshake is nowhere to be found to be legally binding for Germans. Now, the court stated that by refusing to shake hands with a person of the opposite sex, the plaintiff had expressed his, quote, fundamentalist cultural concepts and values. A person who applies for German citizenship who, due to his fundamentalist cultural and moral views, refuses to shake hands with a woman does not evidence his acceptance of German societal norms if such a refusal is based on the social norm that such physical contact may be perceived as unmoral or bear in it the risk of sexual temptation. That's a quote. That's obviously translated from German to English. Now, at court, the questions posed to the plaintiffs were very similar to those the so-called Muslim test, a controversial interview guideline used by the naturalization authorities in the state of Baden-Württemberg in 2006, and which initially targeted only Muslim applicants. In this questionnaire, stigmatizing questions of the Muslim population were assumed to lack, who were assumed to lack a commitment to the free democratic legal system, but legal scholars consider this questionnaire as being in violation with the UN Convention against all forms of racial discrimination, ICERD, because these questions were aimed and only aimed at certain perceived and expected answers from Muslims with the aim to then exclude them from citizenship. Now, as of now, the 2021 provision, there was another provision now added to the Nationality Act, according to which petty offenses, which are otherwise irrelevant, stand in the way of naturalization if the motives were anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic, or otherwise inhumane, in accordance then with the section in the German Criminal Code. Now, penalties are thus not only increased when they are considered anti-Semitic or racist or xenophobic, but they are also become a hindrance for naturalization. Now, in particular, the question of whether anti-Semitic motives are present, or whether they, the question is then becomes the anti-Semitism starting to pose a challenge as long as the definition of anti-Semitism is the subject of particularly controversial discussions in Germany and beyond, reflected in the debate about political instrumentalization of the fight against anti-Semitism. The UN Special Rapporteur against Racism in 2022 warned that the working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, in which 7 of 11 related contemporary examples of anti-Semitism refer to the criticism of the State of Israel, and that there is a concern that this definition will be invoked and used in the context of law enforcement, restricting, for example, freedom of expression and assembly, or at least might have a chilling effect. And you can see how this debate is now entering the very laws of naturalization. Second example, the German Federal Constitutional Court in 2020 cleared the way for the so-called judicial neutrality law for the German states. This law allows the states to exclude female clerks wearing the headscarf from certain training activities in court and in the public prosecutor's office. So these laws bear the concept of neutrality. They're called neutrality laws, judicial neutrality laws, and at the same time signal a shift towards a totally newly created constitutional value that strives to no longer uniformly understand the neutrality of the state and doesn't necessarily understand neutrality of all of the state, but all of a sudden there's a new constitutional value which is called the neutrality of the judiciary, that branch in particular. Because in 2015, the Federal Constitutional Court allowed teachers now as civil servants to teach in schools under the heading of state neutrality, but as of 2020, they carved out a new constitutional value, which is judicial neutrality. So now it's not only state neutrality. They're basically, as someone was saying, the goalposts are changing, right? Now we're talking about judicial neutrality. And so for the first time, the Federal Constitutional Court distinguished neutrality as in state neutrality in schools, where female teachers as civil servants are allowed to wear the headscarf since 2015. And it distinguishes that from state neutrality for the judiciary, where judicial professionals are not allowed to wear the headscarf. And thus, neutrality here is used as a concept for exclusion from the liberal Rechtsstaat. Third example, the recent case of a potentially dangerous person. Now that's a term coming from, it used to be a working definition for the German police, and it's now entering kind of German law. The potentially dangerous person, the Gefährder. That case, decided by the Federal Administrative Court in 2020, concerned a deportation order against a non-German Muslim. And in this case, it's interesting because we can see what 20 years after 9/11, security authorities and courts have learned about Islam and whether they incorporate knowledge about Islam to either nuance their knowledge or rather stigmatize Muslims as a group. Now, that deportation order was based on an objective prognosis, the word objective comes in here, by the security authorities on how dangerous the person is. So this prognosis included the following paragraph, quote, "Since August 6, 2019, for example, he has been regularly performing Islamic prayers, learning prayer surahs, having his mother explain the ritual ablution to him, and him visiting a local mosque as part of his Friday prayers. He told his mother that he had read both the Quran and the Torah in prison. It was clear from statements made to his mother that the plaintiff viewed police officers as dirty infidels, and thus as part of the state's repressive apparatus and as enemies. He intended to take revenge on the police in the state of Lower Saxony in the close temporal context of the residence law measures taken against him. In this context, the plaintiff referred to Allah, who would help him commit his crime." Now, you see here that religious practice factors into this prognosis of security authorities and the court on whether a person is considered to be dangerous, i.e. a threat to the security of the Federal Republic of Germany, and whether based on that, he needs to be deported. So while in the court decision, many other data were gathered to objectively assess the dangerousness of that person, and of course, they do also mention that he was dealing with drugs, he was in circles where people traded with weapons, but still that paragraph on his religious practice, you wonder why that becomes part of the assessment, and thus religious practice then becomes part of the sticky points, the stickiness that connects dangerousness with Islam, even in liberal courts. And it's exactly these kind of paragraphs that then affect not only the plaintiff in this individual case, but go beyond to affect Muslims as a group. Now, these three examples, to me at least, they show that objectivity and neutrality, considered as building blocks of the liberal legal order, are suspiciously close to the concepts of exclusion from citizenship, exclusion from full judicial training, let alone the profession of a judge, exclusion from protection against deportation despite permanent residency. We're talking about people here with permanent residency. And the idea that objectivity and neutrality in a liberal Rechtsstaat are linked to more inclusion and protection against arbitrariness, at least is not fulfilled regarding some groups in Germany. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Or hear me well? It's just my hazzi. I always get to follow really strong talks like that and make me really to set the bar way too high. So thank you for that, but not thank you. I just also want to thank Abdullah and the organizers at Georgetown, Qatar, for the invitation. I also want to thank all the workers here for the unthanked labor, and that includes tech over there, but also the folks who are serving us food, making us food, cleaning up the place, keeping the toilets clean. So I just want to recognize them and thank them very much. So this article, this was a piece was actually, I appreciate the invitation from Abdullah because it's a piece that I wrote right before COVID, and it was published this year in a fantastic anthology that I encourage you to read by Tom Aiello on the history of police brutality in the United States, and it's filled with a number of brilliant academics, many who are young, and who I was really excited to learn from. So. In 2009, Imam Luqman Amin Abdullah was shot 20 times and mauled by an FBI dog. in Detroit. Many of us in this room have already written about Imam Luqman. Formerly active in the Black Power movement, as Imam of the Masjid al-Haq, he was involved in poverty alleviation in Detroit and the campaign to free Jalil al-Amin, the political prisoner formerly known as H. Rap Brown, who founded the National Ummah. Spied on for years for his activism in al-Masjid al-Haq, the FBI alleged that Abdullah was, quote, a radical fundamentalist and a member of the National Ummah, which the FBI describes, quote, as a group of mostly African-American converts to Islam, which seeks to establish a separate Sharia law-governed state within the United States, unquote. Sylvester Johnson shows us how Islamophobia is deployed as a justification for targeting and surveillance of politically engaged Black American Muslims, like Imam Luqman. But I also want to assert something else, that Islamophobia and anti-Arabness work socio-politically and institutionally in the service of white supremacy, and specifically anti-Black structures in the settler colony now known as the United States. In the decade after 9/11, in that settler colony, because Islamophobia circulates as an acceptable form of racism, and I want to also add, Islamophobia also enables a certain form of acceptable sexism. This is the stigma about what Sahar, sort of acceptable stigma, or no stigma to what Sahar was alluding to. Islamophobia provides a discursive, social, and political refuge for white supremacists, including liberals, to shore up the association between whiteness and social order. The social order is maintained through state surveillance, police brutality, and imperial war. Whiteness consolidated itself within the mainstream through Islamophobia, offering a socially acceptable form of anti-Blackness. That is, the Arab Muslim terrorist, let alone the Black Muslim himself or herself, comfortably stood in as the speakable supplement for the figure of the Black militant and the Black criminal, unquote. While nationalist groups like Patriots' Pride, populated by many law enforcement and ex-military folk, have been active in groups like Act for America, or Pam Geller's Stop Islamization, or whatever it's called, frequently and that frequently converge with white supremacists around the Muslim threat. And also Anne Coulter and Brigitte Gabriel regularly covert with and praise the Proud Boys and VDARE, who are explicitly fascist organizations in the United States. In recognizing this, I'm linking but I'm going to sort of zoom in on the institutional element, not this sort of fascist organizing, which the United States is a fascist country at this point, so it's to be known. But I'm concentrating on the institutional here. In recognizing this, I am linking the expanded authority of white supremacist legal, political, and ideological systems that has resulted in the murder of Black people by hyper-enfranchised and militarized police, and the retrenchment of white nationalism to the accepted legitimacy of Islamophobia as a mode of organizing political and civil society, and as a place of convergence between American liberals and fascists, as I think Sahar was alluding to as well. Simone Brown's Dark Matters on the intimate constitutive histories and systems of surveillance of Black communities encouraged me to focus on US law enforcement as an example of Islamophobia, where Islamophobia provides a refuge for the state-sanctioned anti-Blackness, a refuge that provided a safe space in the public sphere for the radicalization of the white American population. Deepa Kumar spoke earlier of the NYPD the surveillance, and particularly she was referring to really, I think, also the police policy paper called Radicalization in the West, a Homegrown Threat, and the NYPD surveillance program that follows that tracked Muslims throughout New York as well as surrounding states. And this report is now, by the way, published by an anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, white supremacist press and actually sold on Amazon. The causal logic of this report is clear. Any locality where Muslims congregate, wherever Muslims live, socialize, learn, shop, pray, and organize, collectively or individually, constitutes, quote, incubators of extremism, according to the report. Indeed, the incubators cross material and virtual space, and specifically, quote, are often embedded in legitimate institutions, businesses, clubs, and of course, in the virtual world of the internet, unquote. So basically, wherever a Muslim is, wherever they're doing, legitimate space or not, they're a threat. The report stated, therefore, by mere fact of existing, not in isolation, and in isolation, the Muslim, and by extension, the black person, is an imminent threat. The 2007 report also notes typical signatures that purportedly indicate whether a Muslim is a legitimate suspect of terror. These signatures mark the transition from being a potential terrorist, inherent to every Muslim, of course, to an actual terrorist suspect. Two of these racialized signatures are, one, becoming involved in social activism and involved in community issues. And the second is giving up cigarettes, drinking, gambling, and urban hip-hop gangster clothes, unquote. This is from the report. Other signatures are relevant when, such as, to pay attention to when a Muslim becomes alienated from one's former life, affiliating with like-minded individuals, unquote, and relatedly, quote, joining and forming a group of like-minded individuals in the quest to strengthen one's dedication to Salafi Islam, unquote. And you are allowed to laugh. These signatures operate along a long chain of associations that invoke and mobilize a series of anti-black tropes, alerting us to the threat to white social order, right? The black woman social worker, the black male protester, the black queer community organizer, or contrarily, perhaps, the black trans worker, sex worker, the hip-hop gangster, the drunk and gambling criminal, i.e., black man. In the NYPD report, each of these stock anti-black stereotypes transfigure into the perpetual suspect of the Muslim terrorist. Both figures are gauged against the universalized civility of the cis-hetero white male citizen of U.S. social order, the good voter, right? That is, the NYPD report produces discourses of policing, operationalizing a well-known associative process inherent to racial profiling. This associative process, this racial sort of signification system of white supremacy as normalcy, rivets the Muslim threat to the black threat. Muslims and black Americans are collapsed in order to justify surveillance of Muslim Americans. On the other hand, Islamophobia is the cloak that hides and furthers the operations of state-sponsored anti-blackness. That same year that Imam Luqman was murdered, a report on black identity extremists, which for formally we need to know, there is no such thing, but they call them BIE, by the Department of Homeland Security's Virginia Fusion Center, concludes its findings asking whether, quote, whether there are any known links between black separatist organizations and radical Islamic organizations in Virginia. This is a structural, not coincidental supposition. In 2017, 9 days before the Fascists Unite the Right rampage in Charlottesville, the FBI issued a report not about white supremacist groups responsible for more than half the FBI-determined extremist murders that year, but by the alleged black identity extremists' attack on law enforcement. Specifically, the FBI report associates the alleged militant allegedly militant black consciousness groups like Black Lives Matter group, right, and the non-existent Black Panthers. This is, I'm not lying, they make this up. And I'm not making this up. In 2000, they say that the Black Panthers exist in 2017, right? They associate them with the Nation of Islam, Jalil Amin's National Ummah, and the Moorish Science Temple. The pedigree of associating black power and black consciousness with Muslimness, and therefore terror, goes back decades. Hoover's FBI report on RACOM, racial conditions, tracked black civil rights organizers, especially black Muslims, who were conscientious objectors and determined them as potential threats because they were seen as potential allies to the Japanese during World War II. The, quote, the Muslim cult of Islam, a 1959 FBI report targets the Nation of Islam as, quote, a fanatic Negro organization purporting to be motivated by religious principles of Islam, but actually dedicated to the propagation of hate against the white race, unquote. The Nation of Islam reportedly uses, quote, the white man as a scapegoat, and their ideology is tinged with primitivism that has almost regressed to savagery, unquote. The 1940s and 50s FBI reports draw on the 1920s racist classic, The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy by Lothrop Stoddard. Citing the Orientalist William Palgrave's theory of the anti-Western Muslim imperialist, and he was also the founder of like the Muslim sleeper cell, that is Palgrave, not Stoddard. Stoddard concludes that Muslims, quote, have a tendency towards understanding between Asiatic and African races and creeds in order to forge a pan-colored alliance against white domination, because we would not want that at all, unquote. This threat is amplified in that the Arabs and black Africans have also commingled and, quote, swapped blood. Insofar as he is Islamicized, quote, the Negro's warlike propensities will be inflated, and he will be used as a tool of pan-Arab Islamicism, seeking to drive the white man from Africa and make the continent his own, unquote. Stafford may be one of the progenitors of the symptomatic replacement theory that intertwines a fear of the black planet with the fear of a Muslim planet. It is a relationship that Suhail Dulatsai notes in describing the FBI's targeting of Muhammad Ali, the boxer, as, quote, a fear of containment of the blackness of the green menace. Thank you.
Thank you all for these fascinating presentations. I'm sure they will elicit very great questions from the audience. First, I have a question for each panelist, and I'm basing my question on the work that each of you is doing to develop practices and intellectual tools to address Islamophobia and racism today. First to Professor Sahar Aziz, you're the founding director of the Center for Security, Race and Rights based at Rutgers University. I would like to hear you more on the work that this organization is doing in advocating for civil and human rights in America's diverse Muslims. So what approach this organization is taking to tackle Islamophobia?
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for giving me an opportunity to do a pitch for the center. The Center for Security, Race and Rights, which is the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, which sadly is needed because these issues are not going away. One of the kind of recommendations when we think of moving forward that's really important, and it started organically, but I don't think it's nearly at the level that it should be based on the need, which is institutionalization of our common defense. The challenge that Muslims and Arabs and Muslim adjacent people faced, especially probably in the first 10 years after 9/11, was we were caught blindsided, flat-footed, unprepared for the enormous resources that were being put by the state and by this private Islamophobia network to attack us. And so we didn't have an NAACP. We didn't have a legal defense fund. We didn't have an anti-defamation league. We didn't have a lot of these institutions. We had CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, but in 2001 it had been less than 10 years old, and it was still very nascent. And we just didn't have the institutions that are necessary to protect the minority communities, because for better or worse, the United States, because of racialization and its long history of racism being the organizing principle, identity politics is a necessity of survival. And again, we can have an academic debate about whether that's, identity politics is a good or a bad idea, but it is American tribalism, right? America is a tribal society, and identity politics is the way that it manifests itself. And so until that goes away, which means you have to get rid of racism, and good luck with that, effectively you institutionalize your defense. And so one of the things that the Center CSRR, I'll just put the pitch for those of you on social media, RUCSRR, Rutgers CSRR on Instagram, please follow us. But what we do is we are institutionalizing the defense of those rights, and specifically holding the United States government and the United States public accountable for equal application of constitutional rights. Because what you find when racialization happens, one indicia of it, is when the privileged group engages in a certain type of behavior, and they are protected by the Constitution or by civil rights, and the underprivileged or unprivileged group is exercising similar behavior, and they're criminalized or stigmatized or politically marginalized. So for example, right, think of the white extremist groups. It's all free speech. Yes, they may get criticized for being racist and being white supremacist, but they're not going to jail for it. Whereas if someone who is Muslim and who is a political dissident engages in any kind of political non-mainstream rhetoric, they are literally criminalized. It's not simply, okay, we don't agree with you, this is not mainstream, we're going to have a debate on the merits, but no, you're going to go to jail for that, or we're going to try to take away your visa or your citizenship. Similarly, right now what we're seeing is with the issue of Palestinian human rights. This has become a very big issue where if you are Muslim or if you are Arab and you defend Palestinian human rights, you are categorically accused of being anti-Semitic, which is an Islamophobic trope, right? So we have a report coming out called Presumptively Anti-Semitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, because it's racist to assume that someone, just because they're Muslim or just because they're Arab, that they are born to hate Jews, that we have this genetic inferiority that we hate Jews, which is false, as opposed to saying, we don't agree with your political stance, and we're going to have a debate about it. But what's happening is if any Arab or Muslim student group or faculty want to go and talk about Palestine from the perspective of Palestinians, from the experiences of Palestinians, they are censored, they are marginalized, they are disciplined, and that is completely antithetical to American free speech norms. And so that is an example of, okay, either you need to just accept and admit we are a country of censorship and free speech is just a talking point and it's propaganda, or we really do believe in free speech and we're going to equally apply it to everybody. And then when we have debates or disagreements, it's on the merits. It's not based on slander and ad hominem attacks and presumptions of hatred when you have absolutely no evidence of that, when really the disagreement is a political disagreement, right? So effectively, the center focuses on these types of issues to really hold the country accountable for making sure there are not what I call racial boundaries or racial limitations of US constitutional and civil rights.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to ask Professor Ma if you could talk about your historical approach to Islamophobia. What lessons, cautionary tales, or repertoire of ideas does history offer to help understand and address the exclusion and oppression of diverse Muslim communities in the PRC today?
I will talk about Muslim responses or Muslim strategy towards Islamophobia, both from historical cases to today. I think historically, when Muslims were attacked as foreigner, as barbarian, as Turks, there are several ways Chinese Muslim intellectuals responded. The first one is they tried to dissociation of Islam from ethnicity. As I mentioned, in Imperial China, Islam was actually translated as the religion of Uyghur, religion of Hui. So some Chinese Muslim intellectuals, they began to interpret the Chinese character Hui etymologically, philosophically, not really ethnically. They said Hui, actually, the Chinese term means return. So to be a Muslim, it doesn't mean Uyghur. It actually means return to Allah, return to God, return to Mecca. So this is one way. The second one is they totally changed the name of Islam, because the majority Chinese, they call Islam as the religion of Hui. Now Muslim intellectuals, they actually say, no, this is not really the religion of Hui. This is the religion of pure and true. So that's why you can imagine pure and true really represent kind of sanitization of Islam, because for ancient time, Chinese Buddhists, they use the pure and the true, refer to some kind of Buddhist practice, devotion. Then Muslims began to also use this term, and actually Jews also use the pure and the true, refer to Judaism, I think at least by 17th century. So that's why you really have kind of sanitization strategy. And also finally, you really have all this Muslim intellectual, they try to, and they actually composed a really rich literature. It's called Han Kitab, or Chinese books, basically try to eradicate the suspicion of Han Chinese, of Islam and Muslims. So that's a literary response. Then in the Republic period, actually, I think Muslims were more active, involved in politics, economy, even military. As we know, the second commander-in-chief in the Republic period actually was a Muslim. Several provinces were controlled by Muslim warlords. So that's Islamophobia was not really as serious as I would say in today. So that's the probably more political, social responses. But today I think it's more difficult to respond to Islamophobia in China simply because the traditional Chinese culture now is equal as kind of contemporary socialism. So anti-traditional Chinese culture basically means anti-socialism, which is more like a political accusation. So that's why I think Chinese Muslims nowadays are very actively adjusted to this new challenge. For example, you begin to raise all this communist flag in a mosque. You basically try to sanitize Islam, not only try to limit speaking Arabic. And actually, interesting enough, I think in 2018, there is a document from central government. They basically expressed a concern about Muslims speaking Arabic. You see. For Chinese Muslim, you really don't speak Arabic as a language. It's more like a greeting, salam. But government even expressed a concern, there is a desanitization process. Some people translate as a de-Chinanization. So that means you have to give up. So nowadays, I think even wear like a Arab-style robe and speaking more Arabic vocabulary can be very dangerous. So that's why I think Chinese Muslims try to distance from Middle East and especially Arabs. So that's when they usually have kind of Southeast Asian connection with Chinese Muslim. It's more, I would say, less sensitive. But in future, I think it's really hard, especially for Chinese Muslim, to depend on external, I would say, resources. I think Professor Hashimi mentioned already, you already see in terms of weaker case, you have all these Muslim and Arab diplomats visited Xinjiang, openly supported communists for suppressing Uyghurs. So I think for the Chinese Muslim or Chinese speaking Muslim, it's really hard to rely on all these foreign countries to combat Islamophobia in China. But we actually see several useful means. The first one probably is the medium. In Middle East or even in Islamic world, I think in Qatar, Al Jazeera really played a very good example in how to improve Muslim image. Even in China nowadays, when people look at Al Jazeera, you really have positive message, not really like other medium. That's the way I think in future we may pursue. The second one probably is more about public discourse, forum, because nowadays all these major powers, no matter India and China or US, they really care about soft power. So if you have a very powerful forum, I think that will really help reducing Islamophobia in China. And the third one, I think, is actually more like a legal approach. Personally, I'm involved in this Zhenhe Forum. So if we just introduced, we try to build kind of bridge between the Muslim world and China, try to promote understanding. But for legal approach, we realize sometimes it's really hard for some Islamophobes to give up their prejudice, because it's not simply about ignorance. It's really about their political ambition. It's really about, So that's why I think especially for like OIC, if you can, label, identify all these major Islamophobes in major countries, then at least you can block, the entrance into Muslim country. Because it's really hard for a country, for example, Turkey, try to speak out against all this Islamophobia in Sweden or something. But I think it's really hard to request the Swedish government to take any action. But I think, for example, Turkey and other Muslim countries, they can block all these Islamophobes from entering into Muslim country. So that's, I think, several method or strategy maybe we can consider.
Thank you very much. And to build on this legal dimension, I would like to ask Professor Nahed Samour, as you have served as a clerk at the Court of Appeal of Berlin, what was your experience there, and did it entail addressing issues related to race and religion? And more broadly, how do you bridge your research and professional experience in the legal field?
So your question makes me want to speak about the question of visibility. We already had this morning, Andrew Hammond, I think, brought it up, the question of visibility and being Muslim. And I think we can see like three categories here of how you can or cannot be Muslim in Germany, for that matter. So you're either not seen, you're the kind of, there's this, Sultan Duran speaks about the concept of the minor citizen. You're not even seen as a citizen, right? I mean, either, one of the things is, your needs, whether you need a bigger mosque, whether you want to have, teachings of whether it's languages or religion or whatever, you're not even seen as a citizen with rights. I mean, as of recently, people are stripped of their right to protest when it comes to Palestine, right? So you're not seen as a citizen, right? And also we have a growing cohort of stateless people in Germany, right, which is largely Palestinians and Kurds. So the statelessness also is like a legal category that puts people, even on a lesser scale than those with a foreign nationality, right? So you're either not seen, or you are seen. That's largely the headscarf issue, right? But but you're seen. But then it's the visibility. But then there's also hypervisibility, right? There are all these kind of degrees of basically how you're marked in public, right? By either not seeing you, or the hypervisibility usually comes with anything that has to do with being a threat, right? Whether it's terrorism, but we're talking here about terrorism and how it kind of trickles down to questions of surveilling school children, right? I mean, the terrorism is just a big name for something, right? For surveillance, obviously, for regulating, for monitoring, for all these kind of things, So, for instance, just one of the I mean, one of the recent cases is, a student says Free Palestine, and you have immediately not just the local police district involved, you have the state district involved regarding state security, right? So, I mean, all of a sudden it becomes hyper-visible. The child isn't seen as a child anymore, right? So in that sense, you have almost like these two things of infantilizing, because you have to teach the Muslim subject, right? You have to teach them about democracy. You have to teach them about tolerance. You have to teach them about anti-Semitism. The Muslim becomes this object or subject of you're teaching them, right? And obviously that then helps to portray who you want to be, right? I mean, so the Muslim is who you don't want to be, So and here obviously it's not being modern, homophobic, anti-Semitic, against LGBTIQ rights, all of that, that's what the Muslim is, right? And so I mean, when you ask me the question of courts, I mean, I have to say that I think it's interesting, in Berlin in particular, they have also Berlin Neutrality Act, right? And so that prohibits, again, visibly Muslim, which could be the headscarf, but it could also be impendant, right? With like a Quranic surah or Allah, whatever, I mean, what the jewelry fashion has, yeah? So all of that would prohibit you from clerking, from being even part of the jury or a judge. And in part that, reminds me, unfortunately, I mean, it obviously is not the same, but like 100 years before that in Prussia, Jews to become legal clerks, they had to convert to Christianity. Now, they're not asking Muslims to convert to Christianity, but they're asking them not to make their Muslimness visible, right? So just don't, I mean, this is in that sense, there's lots actually written about Europe's total denial of race and religion, in that constellation actually, right? It's a total denial. We're post-National Socialism. We're post-genocide. No one has to teach us what this is about, and it has a good narrative, and the narrative is called neutrality. Don't we all want a neutral state? And then the legal literature is full of, it's a kind of equidistance to religions, right? I mean, we're not hostile to religions. We're in equal distance to all religions so that we can preserve this neutral rule of law, So there is this, it's almost like, being in the closet almost as a Muslim, right? And it's interesting because you see this liberalism, illiberalism at the same time, right? Because actually Germany is doing big moves ahead with LGBTIQ rights, So there's like I mean, obviously, the LGBTIQ community is asking for more, but what I want to see is you have at the same time liberalism and illiberalism, right? And I could even make the story kind of even messier because the new Nationality Act is going to allow more Syrian Muslims into the German state. So we will see huge demographic changes in Germany, which is the dream and nightmare of some people, right? I mean, I know that. Anyhow, I mean, people have been speaking a lot about how Europe's demographics are going to change, and what this is going to be. But I mean, one more thing is, so people don't want to talk about race in Germany. They think that's a question of that's a Nazi term, which of course we know it's not, because race is a transhistoric and transnational term. You cannot box it, neither in that period between 1933 and 1945, and you cannot, give it just a German, it's not a German thing, race, obviously, right? I mean, there's all the history about it. But you can see how race has been substituted by culture, right? And so even Adorno, I think obviously in the 50s, he wrote how culture has become the substitute for the ugly word race. That's because their culture is like this. That's their culture, The backwardness, the spirituality, it becomes almost similar then to the Catholic, the Kulturkampf in the Bismarck times, right? So the Protestantism actually of the state comes out. Be Muslim, but be it inside of you. Be it only for yourself. Don't show it. Don't practice. Don't contaminate it almost, And it's like the question of, how to contain Muslimness. That's probably, one of the questions.
Thank you. Now, moving to the American context, Professor Stephen Sheehi, I was very impressed by your project, Decolonizing Humanities, that seeks to make a transformative impact on higher education. I was wondering if you could tell us more about the practice of decoloniality in relation to religion, and also in relation to the mission of that project to develop new pedagogical tools at the university level. What set of tools do you think that students need today to be better prepared to face the challenges of their time pertaining to race and religion?
En bref. Just like in 30 words and less. I will be brief. It's a big question. It's number one, I don't want to drag decoloniality because I'm all into that. But obviously the word is dangerous nowadays too when we speak about it at the institutional level, because there is no such thing as institutional decoloniality. They're antithetical to one another. A decolonial paradigm is one that is, in my view, a revolutionary paradigm that aims to dismantle all forms of racial capitalism, cis heteronormativity, and obviously, racialism, racism in general. So I think as an institutional project, it's impossible. What we do in the very humble space that we have at William & Mary is to think about the convergence in which these things come together, the convergence of which we can understand Islamophobia as a set of social relations, as racism as a set of social relations, just like capitalism is a set of social relations that mediates all of our interactions. So if capitalism is a set of social relations that mediates all of our interactions daily, and as well as our understandings of ourselves, then what is the role of Islamophobia in maintaining those set of social relations? And those social set of relations are invariably always ones of domination. So in the very, again, small spaces that we might do in William & Mary is to think about through pedagogical practice at some level, but also in the way we sort of try to establish relationships with one another and our students and the communities in which we are living, to start to become conscious of this, precisely of the sort of inequality of these social relations in which we live, if that makes sense. And so, in other words, hopefully by understanding how Islamophobia functions within imperial United States, we also are going to understand, we can't avoid but understanding how racial capitalism, works in the United States, how, the United States is an imperial power, how it is how it functions on cis heteronormativity, and so on.
Yeah. Thank you. The first question I have from the audience actually builds on this set of ideas and is asking specifically about the term Islamophobia. It's addressed to the entire panel. Do you think that the term Islamophobia is accurate to use for the deliberate otherization of Muslims? Since a phobia could be something naive, do you think that the term anti-Islam describes the situation better?
So I'll start.
Thank you.
This is a perennial debate, an academic debate. So I've kind of gone on the record in my book saying that I'm not as concerned with the terminology. I do think Islamophobia is a much broader term. I mean, literally speaking, it is the fear of Islam or the fear of Muslims, the hostility towards Islam and Muslims. I think anti-Muslim racism is more accurate in terms of, at least in my field of law, when looking at what the processes and the consequences. And so racism in kind of a legalistic term is when you have two similarly situated individuals or groups that are being treated disparately. And the explanation for that disparate treatment, meaning one group is treated better than the other, is their racial identity, right? The race as a social construct. So it is very much about how individuals are mistreated or treated less than or treated as inferior and harmed through government action, policies, private action. Whereas Islamophobia, I see it as a much kind of the broader environment and context. So that I don't, these are debates that we could have forever. But what's interesting to me is what are the causes and what are the connections between the past and the present, and why? Why is there an obsession with Islam and Muslims? Why is there a fear and also a philia, right? The exotic and the otherization. And I think that is something that, there's been much literature on this. Joseph Massad has written a book called Islam in Liberalism, and there are others who have talked about how the West, in particular Europe, but I think now the United States more recently, needs Islam as a foil, as like this mirror. They need to show that they are better, to convince themselves they're better than, and it's the Muslim world and Muslims, whether it's within their countries or in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. And that pathology is troubling, and I think it says more about the West than it does about the Middle East or global East. And so there is kind of this concern of, why can't you leave us alone? Just leave us alone.
Anything to add to this?
Well, I think Islamophobia really capture all these different manifestations and context. In Chinese context, for example, in imperial time, when we look at all these Confucian scholars, they really don't understand what is Islam. They even had no interest in understanding Islam, but it's just fear, simply because it's different. They said, all these people practice some, it's like a calendar for the Hui people. They speak some secret words. They can travel thousands miles without any connection. So that kind of fear they had, because you have to think about the local context. The Confucian Chinese context, they only visit your family member or relatives or friends. That's supposed to be normal. But how can Muslims from this province visit that province and even to study there, and they provide free food, free accommodation? That really fear the Chinese. So I think Islamophobia probably can capture this kind of situation.
Great. We have another question that continues a discussion we had in the earlier panel with Professor Kumar on activism. So Islamophobia intersects with other forms of discrimination, such as racial profiling, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments in the US and also in Germany, as Professor Samour described. What is the role of civil society organizations, religious leaders, and advocacy groups in combating these? Big question again.
I'm going to start with the difficulties of mobilizing around these questions. And of course, obviously, at this point, I'm talking about Germany only. Now, you could, when Germany discussed circumcision, and the German parliament almost went to prohibit circumcision in Germany, because there was a case, obviously, I'm interested in cases. So there was a Muslim boy, and his parents, and even the doctor was Muslim, and the circumcision didn't go well, and so the parents sued the doctor before a criminal court. And so it was all about Muslims in this case, right? And then all of a sudden, all these legal scholars came about to say, this circumcision, it's barbarian and it's hurting the well-being of the child, and it should be done only for medical reasons, no other reasons, etc. So German parliament almost bended towards prohibiting circumcision, until the moment the Jewish community spoke up, right? And then the sentence then Chancellor Merkel said was, Jewish life has to be possible in Germany, so of course we have to allow circumcision, right? So that's one of these cases, we can see the hierarchies and how they're playing out in the law, right? And you can see, for Muslims, it was a moment when they were like, okay, let's lean back, let's have the Jews do the job, because obviously our life, because no one said Muslim life has to be possible in Germany. No one said that. The question was like, so then what happens to Muslim life? Is it not worthwhile protecting, their rituals, what do Muslim parents do then once they have a boy? The panic in the many eyes of the parents who had boys around that period, right? So you see, it's difficult. It's difficult when the state actually entrenches hierarchies rather than, so it wasn't, because it wasn't really a moment of collaboration. The Jews didn't do it for the Muslims. They had nothing to do with that, They had nothing to do with the case. That's what I mean, right? But then, of course, they knew they had to step up now, And so it's actually almost at that moment when Germans realized, oh, Jews have a religion. Because, 200, 300 years of assimilation stopped making them see them as people who have a religion. They only have a culture. The Einsteins and Hannah Arendts and all these people had a culture. And because we couldn't recognize them as Jews anymore because of all the assimilation, right? They weren't wearing the kippah, the woman wearing the wigs. I'm talking here about Germany before kind of the East Russian, the Russian Jews came in where you could see that they're Jewish, right? So I want to say so they forgot that there is a religion, right? It's only culture almost, And again, why am I saying this? Because there seems to be, again, to me it seems as if Germany is only now kind of coming to terms the 75 years after genocide, when there was, kind of a monocultural, there was basically two churches, right? That's it in Germany, right? We never had to discuss what religion and race meant after genocide until now, and someone said it earlier on, I think Anne Norton with the Dutch, the Germans too were like, oh my God, these Muslims are bringing back religion and race. Because after genocide, we didn't have to deal with either, basically, right? And so it's difficult mobilizing almost, at the same time, of course, Germany too is using interfaith to depoliticize all the political questions, So much is kind of invested in, there's projects called Shalom Alaikum, or, it's really that, and rabbis and imams, on a tandem bike and all of these kind of things, But at the same time, what's happening is basically the German state presenting itself as saving the Jewish body from the Muslim, So I'm just, I'm totally, I think we need more space to discuss how these solidarities and alliances can work. But clearly at this point, the German state is it's entrenching hierarchies. We're not meeting, there's no egalitarian discourse. There are desired minorities and non-desired minorities, right? That's very clear, And it's very clear that, just when George Floyd was killed, the German left liberals wanted to delete race from the Constitution. They thought that was an anti-racist act to delete it, because they still haven't understood that, of course, it's not a biological concept. But anyhow, So, Germany was almost about to change its constitution to delete race until the moment the Central Council of Jews speaks up and says, no, we lobbied in the 48 explicitly to have race in the Constitution, right? We didn't want it to be about Jews only. We wanted it to be bigger, right? And now, of course, that debate has died. So it's problematic because obviously we need the Jews to protect the lives of Muslims and other minorities, but at the same time, it's constantly, establishing this prism and the paradigm that the only kind of community that can make sure it can mobilize as a minority around questions of race and religion is that one community, So I would have loved to say something more positive on that, and people are always looking around for better examples, right? How are they doing it in the US? How are they doing it in the UK? How, or wherever else in the world, right? But at this point, the state plays a very important role in hierarchizing, and, equality then becomes, a goodwill thing. We're distributing equality according to our moral supremacy, to whoever deserves equality in this state.
Thank you. This is very well said. I very much agree that we do need more space to discuss these issues, but today, unfortunately, we're out of time. We will be continuing the conversation tomorrow here at 9 a.m. with a panel on constructing the narrative, Islamophobia and the media, chaired by Jamal El-Shayal from Al Jazeera Network. Thank you all for your great participation today. Thank you, dear panelists.